Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Q&A about future of science and technology. I see a number of questions saved up here. Okay, here's a good meta question from Hunt. What will doing science look like in 20 or even 50 years compared to today? Okay, so here's something I get for being an old fogey, which is I was already doing science 50 years ago. And the one question to start off asking is, how has it changed over the last 50 years? Well, uh, the for me, 50 years ago, I had started to use computers to do science. That's gotten a lot easier. For me personally, I have built a huge technology stack for doing science with computers. I was already on that path even 50 years ago now. What about some other things? So in terms of, for example, communication about science, finding out what's going on in science, well, there were already weekly journals that I used to look at 50 years ago. And gosh, I'm realizing it really is this year, it really is 50 years since I was first employed to do science as a 16-year-old high school kid. But that's at a government lab in England doing theoretical physics. But, so at that time, I was using computers to do science. I was looking at the weekly kind of what's going on in physics kinds of things. There were physics preprints that were getting sent around uh, as things that would arrive and they'd get displayed in a library or you'd get them yourself personally. There wasn't, at that time, 1976, there was just starting to be some email. I used to use a computer on the ARPANET that had at least local email. And actually also the computers at this government lab, place called the Rutherford lab that I worked at, they also had some kind of email-like system. The uh, when it came to doing things like searching for stuff, searching for scientific results and so on, turns out that was already possible 50 years ago. There were databases that collected the abstracts of papers, databases like InSpec and so on, that collected the abstracts of papers, and you could use online systems. There was one called Dialog that you would dial up to, and although actually at the government lab that I worked at, those computers were connected to the ARPANET. So it wasn't even a question of dialing your computer up to a phone line to connect to the ARPANET. It was the computers were all connected to it. So you could go and do searches, at least in the abstracts of scientific papers. Also, if you're a little bit more kind of energetic, you go to the library and go to the Science Citation Index, which was a printed index of all the papers that referenced a given paper. And it also had a thing, a so-called permuterm index, where we actually would just take titles of things and kind of index by all the successive words in the title. Lots of kind of printed on thin paper, thick books, but you could go through and you could find kind of by hand searching, you could find papers that were about particular topics. So those things, it's gotten a lot more streamlined in recent times, but it's still the same basic story. Now, in terms of other kinds of things about sort of doing science and presenting science, well, in those days, you'd write papers, you'd send out preprints, you'd send the papers into journals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One thing that was a little bit different is the papers were typed on a typewriter, and most people didn't type their own papers. They would handwrite them. I did that too, handwrite them and give them to somebody to type them, and then they would show up typed, and then copies would get made, get sent into journals, things like this. That was a transition that happened in the 1980s mostly, is people starting to use to type their papers themselves. And back in the 1970s, most people who were doing science didn't know how to type. And that was a big competitive advantage for people like me who actually could type fast. That decayed rapidly over the years. Well, of course, the other thing that's changed in 50 years, well, there are things that have changed about the social dynamics of science. there are things that have changed about about the tools that one has available, particularly computational tools. And I guess I've spent a significant part of my life building those tools. But to talk about kind of the more of the ambience of doing science, one thing to realize 50 years ago, being, a physics professor or something was a tippity top profession. It was kind of a kind of that's a high aspiration type profession. I would say that the professoring business has definitely degraded in its tippity topness over the years, possibly because it's sort of expanded a lot and it's not quite as elitist as it used to be, for better or worse. I think also back in those days, kind of being an entrepreneur or something was a grimy business and not something that was thought to be kind of a uh, somehow, at least in the intellectual world, that wasn't thought to be kind of a path that one should follow. I kind of broke from that tradition for myself, and now it's certainly a much more kind of the being a tech entrepreneur at times has been seen to be, a tippity top kind of thing to do. It kind of goes up and down as the world changes, but that's a thing that, the idea that there could be a serious entanglement of kind of the entrepreneurial world with the academic intellectual world has definitely changed. Another thing that has changed, I suppose, is the the kind of sort of extra communication that one can have about science, whether it's through social media posts or live streams, other kinds of engagement. I mean, the idea of you give a talk about something, that's been the same forever and ever. I don't think that's changed. Occasionally I'll give talks at universities, and I realized just recently I happened to be giving a talk in Oxford, as it turned out, and I realized I hadn't given a talk in the physics department in Oxford since 1977. And I realized, by golly, it's just the same kind of shtick. The only difference is instead of using overhead projector transparencies, I'm connecting my computer to a projector. But other than that, and I'd like to think the content, at least of things I've said, are rather different. But other than that, it's the same kind of dynamic of, you go, you give the talk, people show up, you go out to dinner afterwards type thing. Um, in terms of the kind of social dynamic of science, I think we were talking about this a couple of live streams ago. Something that's changed is a lot more collaboration in science between a lot more. When you write a paper, it's like there are many authors on that paper. It always used to be, or most of the time in the past, or much of the time at least, in a field like physics, for example, there were many solo author papers, for example, in theoretical physics. That's much less true today. I don't really know what the cause of that is, whether people are actually working differently or whether they are they're doing things that are whether it's just a convention for sort of whose name goes on the paper. I will say, you can say, well, in today's world, you can do remote collaboration. That's a new thing. Well, it's not really a new thing. I did quite a bit of remote collaboration back in the 1970s, even though in those days it was mostly you'd write letters and send them back and forth. And there weren't even very many phone calls actually in those collaborations. Um, I would say, so we're talking about sort of what's science going to be like in 50 years, and I'm sort of talking about what hasn't changed in the last 50 years. And I would say that uh, perhaps the level of cynicism about the processes of the scientific establishment has greatly increased, and probably deservedly so, over that period of time. I mean, in those days, there was sort of a belief that, peer review was kind of a worthwhile, sensible kind of dynamic, whereas today there is deservedly deep, deep cynicism about what it really means and whether it's achieving sort of progress in science or whether it's just kind of a form of anonymous corruption, so to speak, in the dynamics of science. I would say that so, the one thing that I would say for many people has changed, well, actually, a couple of things to say. Uh, the big thing that's changed is ubiquitous computing. Everything is on computers. And for me, that hasn't changed that much in 50 years because I was doing things on computers 50 years ago. But for most people who do science, that has changed. For example, in theoretical science, in the kind of more mathematically oriented sciences, I would say there was kind of a step change in 1988 when we released Mathematica. Before that time, people who were doing theoretical science, it's like you're working out this algebraic computation. It's like you got out your pencil and your pad of paper and you were writing stuff by hand. After that time, there was a pretty rapid transition to, well, you use a computer to do it. And I think the idea that that notion that you can kind of use a computer to do things is sort of everything is now on computers. I mean, it used to be the case people would record information on index cards. Now it would be always in a computer, ever since the 1980s, probably in a computer. When it comes to experimental science, again, gone are the lab notebooks where people would handwrite observations. In what's come in instead is everything is on computers. Now, the fact is, lab automation has not progressed quite as rapidly as one might hope. There's still a lot of instruments where you're still pushing buttons on the front panel to make it do things, even though it might be able to dump its data into a computer. I think it's it's a question, but nevertheless, the types of data, the volumes of data which one can accumulate because computers are in the loop is much higher. Already back in the 70s, in fields like particle physics, there was a substantial amount of data coming in, and it was on computers. But there has been a progressive change that it's gone from megabytes to gigabytes to terabytes to petabytes and beyond of the kinds of data that get collected in serious scientific experiments. So, kind of looking towards the future, I think there are things that I've thought should happen for 40 years and they haven't happened, and maybe they finally will. So I'll give you some examples. So one is kind of using computation as part of the presentation of science. When you read a paper today, it's like the person says yakety yakety yak. And if you want to reproduce what the person did, you're pretty much stuck kind of trying to understand what do they do? Let me write my own program to do that, etc. There have been a bunch of initiatives to get scientists to sort of include raw data, include things that let their science be reproduced. Those efforts have been quite unsuccessful. People are sometimes reluctant to share that kind of inside information. If they share it rather badly in systems that are very hard to actually get the data from. It's a kind of a sorry picture. It's for me, for example, for many years now, I have tried to make everything I do sort of perfectly reproducible and perfectly kind of computationally transparent. So, if you read things that I write, they'll have all kinds of pictures in them. You can click the picture, you'll get a piece of Wolfram language code, you can run it, and you better get that picture again. And that's an important piece in kind of both the reproducibility and the ability to follow on from the science that I've done is this idea that the code is right there. You can just take it and go and build on what's been done in the science. Now, the truth is, that's an idea that I first started talking about, 45 years ago. And the fact that it hasn't happened to date in a serious way is kind of a disappointment in both in the social dynamics of science. It's no longer a technological issue at all. I mean, it is what we've built with Wolfram language is kind of the best instance of being able to do that, both in terms of what we can present, how we can be useful in the science. Also, the fact that we have this kind of unified language so that the kinds of things you want to put in your science paper, there'll be just a small piece of Wolfram language code and it's all defined. It's not like, and it goes to use this library that might have been discontinued and might have been changed and so on over here. It's all kind of a unified thing. The other thing we've achieved, and we're talking about long time scales, is we have essentially perfect compatibility of Wolfram language from when it was first released in 1988 to today. So I will routinely take pieces of Wolfram language code that I wrote in 1990, for example, and fire them up today, and they'll just work. And same with the notebooks that we have that represent kind of the workflow of using that. So I think one of the things that I'd like to see happen, and maybe eventually it will, is kind of this reproducibility and transparency of science, where sort of every picture has code behind it. And when the picture involves data, that data is in a kind of usable form. So we built our Wolfram data repository quite a few years ago now, which is a place where you can put data where it has been put in a form that is standardized enough that you can just pick it up and use it in another piece of code. So quite a lot of things that I've written that involve data, the raw data is in the data repository. The code that you get in the thing I've written references a resource data object from the data repository so that that data can just be pulled in. Now, making data fully reusable is not trivial. I kind of defined years ago kind of 10 levels of making data computable, from just it's in digital form in some way to various kinds of standardization of entities that appear in it as standardized, kind of the way that missing data is represented is standardized, to dates and times are standardized, all those kinds of things. We've built a bunch of tools. Actually, we're building some more tools now to help people kind of take sort of the unwashed data and put it into a somewhat reusable, readily computable form. LLMs and so on help a bit in doing this. In our data curation efforts, it's tended to be kind of a factor of two speed up in what we can do. It's not like you just feed it to the LLM and it does a perfect job. It doesn't, but it can kind of get around certain kinds of things that weren't there. So I think that another piece to this whole story is having things where the everything you're doing is kind of reproducible, computable, and so on. Another thing is kind of the way that you communicate science in terms of how you actually describe what's going on. And I would say that there hasn't been much evolution in the style of scientific papers in the last 50 years, disappointingly so, because back when scientific papers were first a thing in the 1600s, they read a lot like the blog posts of today. They were pretty chatty. They would have things like, and I was studying this goat and it ran away type thing. Whereas in today's world, that would be turned into, I was studying, I don't know the Latin name for a goat. We were the specimen of such and such thing became unavailable in, whatever it was, which means the goat somehow escaped and ran away or whatever. Back in the 1600s, they would have basically just said the goat ran away. Today, they would have to fancify to make it sound more kind of professional and so on, which tends to lose a lot of information. And I would say that different fields of science have evolved differently. I would say there's a trend in the last probably 5 to 10 years of particularly, I would say, in the life sciences, more push towards saying, what's the point of this paper? Having a section about the significance of the paper. That's a good thing to have happened, because otherwise what can happen is that the paper reads kind of like a legal filing of a patent or something. It's like this, and this, and it's all very formalized. And it's like you're just sort of scratching your head about what's the point of this. And sort of the idea of kind of this stilted kind of academic writing, that was a thing 50 years ago. It's a thing today. There have been some things that sort of break out of that. I would say on the web, kind of started, I think, with things like our Math World website, which was then copied by Wikipedia and so on, as kind of a more direct way to sort of express things. In the things I've tried to write, I've tried to sort of express things directly in pretty much the things I've written, starting from starting from sometime in the 1980s. I mean, before that time, I too was writing kind of the stilted academic paper type style. I kind of changed that, and by the time I was writing, for example, documentation for Wolfram language, that was in a much more direct style. So, it's like the actual language that we speak has changed and evolved over 50 years, so to some extent has scientific writing and scientific communication. But then there's the question of what is the formalism? How are you actually describing what you're doing in science? If you look back to, let's say, oh, I don't know, even the 1500s, for example, or 1400s, you'll find people were not really formalizing. Everything was in words. And then along came things like algebra and so on, more formalization of mathematics. By the 1600s, there were lots of the notations of mathematics that we have today were already there. And so people were able to start kind of writing things in this more formal, structured way that mathematics allows you to do and mathematical notation allows you to do. So we have that kind of mathematical structure now. A lot of things are still quite narrative. We also have had for a long time kind of computer pseudocode. What we now have and what I've spent lots of effort on is a kind of a computational language that allows you to represent in a kind of standardized way lots of kinds of things in the world. So if you're trying to describe kind of the geolocations of different species of penguins or something, there is a canonical representation for those penguin species. There's a canonical representation for the geolocations. These are things that become kind of standardized and computable. That's what we've tried to achieve over the last 4 decades with Wolfram language, and kind of expressing yourself in computational language, not only kind of data, but also computations, algorithms, what you're actually doing expressed in computational language. So I think a big thing is the sort of the rise, and it's happened to some extent, not as fast as one would like, the rise of using computational language as part of the thing that carries the message of scientific communication. And I think we've had sort of plain English, we've had diagrams, we've had math formulas. When you're using traditional programming languages, putting big blobs of low-level code is not a thing intended for humans to read. With Wolfram language, with our computational language, it is, if you do a good job writing the language, it can be very succinct, and it is something that humans can read and learn from, just like math formalism is something that humans can read and learn from. So that's something which I would hope that there will be increasing kind of use of computational language as part of scientific communication. So the things you can say become formal and precise and reusable in the same way that in the way that one can do that computationally, so to speak. So another thing I might say about science communication is things like live streams. How much can you see about the actual ongoing doing of science? So far, you can see almost nothing about the ongoing doing of science. All those meetings and discussions between scientists, those are kind of behind closed doors. I have done a fair amount in the last 5, 6 years of kind of live streamed science, a little bit less in the last few years, and we really need to start it again some more, of actually showing, of actually sort of letting the world look in on the actual dynamics of science being done. I think there's a very interesting thing. It's very kind of educational to see how that works. It's something I tend to think I'm prepared to do it because I feel confident and I'm not too embarrassed when I say stupid things. But my academic friends have mostly, well, I believe there's basically zero of that that's gone on in the world to date. That's something that might change, the sort of increasing transparency of how science gets created. I think another kind of other questions about sort of how science gets done. I mean, a lot of the systems of doing science are a little bit under attack as a result of LLMs and AI. Everybody can generate a thing that kind of looks like a science paper. You just tell an LLM some prompt, it'll make a science paper-like thing. Anybody can use LLMs to write reviews of papers if they want to. These are things that are sort of somewhat poisoning the system that had existed. I mean, it used to be the case that preprint servers and so on could just accept anything anybody sent them because nobody would bother to send them anything unless it was an actual science paper that made some sense. but now you can kind of churn out AI generated stuff with incredible ease. And that's kind of making some aspects of kind of the machinery of science creak quite badly. I think that in terms of sort of the use of AI and the doing of science, I think one of the things is kind of on this continuum of how do you find information about what's been done before, from kind of you'd look through the Science Citation Index, you'd use an abstracting service online, to you can do a web search. Well, LLMs and AI provide another level, which is you can kind of search thematically for things. And that's an interesting possibility that I guess I've found myself using increasingly, and something where you can kind of drill in, this specific question. And it's not a question of keyword search, read, try and find it. It's more the LLM will do the drilling for you. And that's a thing that I think is, will make certain things more efficient. It's in a sense, one of the things you hope for in science is that the whole sort of corpus of all those millions of papers that have been published, that it sort of is additive in some sense, and that it's not the case that most of the time you're kind of going back, and I don't really know whether anybody did this before, I have to do it again for myself type thing. So as these kinds of thematic searching capabilities get better, so one can expect sort of more of, yes, you can build on what's already been done to a greater extent. I would say that another thing to mention actually about the doing of science is well, actually a couple of things. So let's talk first of all about the content of the science, and then we'll talk about sort of who gets to do the science. So in terms of the content of the science, every there are these bursts of kind of activity that come about when new methodologies exist for doing particular areas of science. And we can expect that over the next 50 years, there'll be a bunch of those new methodologies, whether it's experimental methods, whether it's theoretical ideas, and so on. I think that there are certain places, I mean, I mentioned this, the kind of excitement of my own efforts in the last 5 years or so that really do seem to be kind of a new level of kind of capability, methodology for theoretical science, kind of building on sort of the last half century of kind of development of sort of the computational paradigm for doing science. I think that's something where we're seeing sort of a burst of activity in a bunch of areas. I would say that one of the things that is sort of a methodological change, I started doing this at the beginning of the 80s, but it's something which is sort of increasingly popular, is kind of computer experiments, and experiments in sort of minimal abstract experiments in the computational universe, so to speak, and the things you can discover from that. It's sort of a different approach to science, where instead of going from the phenomena we observe and measure and drilling down and trying to sort of reverse engineer how the world works, we're sort of going up more from the underlying phenomena of what is computationally possible, and exploring that, the field of reliology that explores kind of the abstract basic science of what happens when you follow rules and so on, how that works, building that up rather than reductionistically going down. And it's somewhat more like the way that pure mathematics is operated, but I think that reliology is a richer and there's more pieces to explore there, and it is also something where there's kind of there's kind of a big collection of things to be discovered that can then be made use of, that can then be sort of pieces of theoretical science that are on the shelf, ready to be applied when one needs them for technology or for other areas of science and so on. I think that the sort of the computational paradigm as a way of thinking about the world is something that I've been pushing now for 45 years or so, but it's something that we're seeing more and more kind of get into science. I mean, one of the transitions that's happened over that period of time is the transition from you're making a model in science, let's make it be in terms of mathematical equations, to let's make it be in terms of computational rules. That's something that sort of silently happened over the last 3 decades or so, a transition from math, it's all math, to it's all sort of computationally defined. I think there are also questions about different fields of science that have had a certain paradigm for operating for a long time, and that paradigm might change. In something like physics, there's been a strong theoretical tradition as well as the experimental tradition. In something like biology, it's been all experiment, no sort of systematic theory or very little systematic theory. That might change. In fields like in fields of social science and so on, same kind of story. How that will change, whether that will change, I think on the timescale of order 50 years, we can expect that that will change quite a bit, that there will be sort of a substantial branch of biology that is really the theoretical side of things that makes more general statements than finding all the experimental details. And I think that's, and in mathematics, kind of the opposite way around. I think experimental mathematics, that's much closer to ruleology, exploring mathematical kinds of ideas, but by doing computer experiments, I think that will become increasingly popular. Again, it's been something that I've done for 50 years now, but it seems it's only gradually kind of gaining in popularity, so to speak. In terms of well, so as I'm saying, the kind of the dynamics of sort of the scientific establishment, the kinds of things that get done, the units of scientific activity, these have all been pretty constant over the last 50 years with sort of incremental change. I don't really expect that to change. Now, there's a question of sort of who gets to do science and how do they get to do it. In the last, there's a question of, for example, doing basic science. Why should one do that? Its payback is 100 years in the future, where payback, if by payback you mean something of kind of technological, medical, whatever significance. And so it's been an interesting question. How does that get done? Where does it get done? For a while, kind of it's been sort of universities and governments are the main places where sort of you get to do kind of this sort of long range intellectual work. I think that it's been a long time question whether there are other models. And in my own life, I've obviously followed a somewhat different model of sort of doing science as a spin-off in a sense from doing technology, although the science also informs the technology and so on. But there's sort of, I've wondered for a long time whether there are sort of fundamentally different dynamics of how basic science should be supported, who gets to do it, the extent to which most people who do it are professionals versus not. I mean, if you go back a few hundred years, the majority, there were a few professional scientists, but the majority of people who were doing science were not doing it for a living. And they were doing it, they made their living some other way. And I think it's been surprising to me the extent to which there isn't much of that happening today, that most people who are doing science are doing it professionally. I'm not quite sure why that is, because I know for myself, doing it, quotes, as a hobby, I think it's fair to say that I managed to produce a lot of fairly substantial science, even though I'm, quotes, doing it as a hobby, CEOing a pretty active company and so on, that you might think would mean that I couldn't possibly have science as a hobby, but at least for me, it's worked well, and I maybe more of that will be seen in the future. I think the efforts of sort of involve everybody in science, kind of the citizen science approach, it's had some successes. I don't think it's been a resounding kind of transforming the face of science kind of idea. I think there are fields of science where it is more realistic for a broader range of people to make contributions. That was true at times in natural history. It's true today in natural history. If you're looking at bird observations or something, the vast mass of those are made by amateurs, so to speak, and are being aggregated in a way that people who are trying to do systematic things can use. I think that ruleology is a place, so the study of simple programs and so on, is a place where one could imagine a very substantial kind of amateur set of contributions where things get discovered that are sort of point things that are discovered that's kind of on the level of, I saw this lesser crested bird in this particular place. It's a computational kind of thing like that. And in the end, if those observations are aggregated in the right way, the result can be something that is useful. I think that in terms of what else to say about the doing of science, I mean, I think in terms of experimental science, there will be more and more automation of how data is taken. That's been very slow to happen, surprisingly slow to happen. And that's a consequence of the details of the kind of social dynamics of science and the way people are trained and the instrument makers, really wanting to have kind of instruments be islands and so on. But it's coming. And I think that it will be, the idea of going into a biolab and seeing lots of people with pipettes, measuring out little pieces of fluid, that really is going to be kind of something that looks very ancient in the future, just as seeing that person, writing out that integral by hand looks very ancient to us post 1988. Well, anyway, so that's a few thoughts on that. Let's see. Well, there's a question here. Several questions. Justine asks, will future scientific knowledge be stored as papers, simulations, executable models, or something totally new? I think a lot of it should be stored as computational essays. Things that have narrative texts that humans understand, together with computational language that humans understand, and computational language that's also understood by computers. So it really is something that is where the computational language is carrying meaning both for humans and for automatic execution on computers. And I think that there's a sort of a question of what's the unit of scientific communication. And that's changed a bit over time, and it's still kind of a mess. I mean, a paper is a certain unit of scientific communication. A book is a certain unit of scientific communication. It has often been difficult to have smaller units of scientific communication than papers. I mean, sometimes there'll be tweets these days. Sometimes there'll be somebody makes an observation and puts it in a big database. I would say that having that sort of sub-paper communication is something that, for example, in radiology, one can imagine that being pretty useful. And I don't think we fully invented the methodology for being able to store things that aren't just yet another bird observation to be put in the database, and isn't at the level of, oh, you have to explain things in words. Now, there's also the question of sort of the book versus paper, etc. And there's a question of sort of how incremental is science. In my own efforts, a lot of things I've done, I can't seem to write things that are less than 100 pages long, because it turns out there's quite a bit to say. And there's sort of, you could break that up into many pieces, but then each piece would have its own separate introduction, and you wouldn't really be able to see the big picture. I would say that that way of doing science is the exception rather than the rule. The vast majority of science that gets done is quite incremental, and it really can say, the joke of science is always, that all papers begin, Smith and Jones recently did this, and now we're going to do that. And that's sort of explaining that the thing you're writing fits right into the flow of what's been done. And I would say that one would like it to be the case that perhaps one would like it to be the case that there's sort of pieces of science where there's really big, intellectual structures that get built. I think there's a limited rate at which those can get built. And those are the things that get communicated in books and so on. I would say that the idea of, for example, it is useful in communicating science that you can have a thing of a delimited size, a paper, a book, whatever else. The website with tentacles everywhere, I think it tends to be a less satisfactory form of communication for sort of a new science thing, because it's kind of like, well, I know this piece, but I don't know that piece, and I don't really get the whole picture and so on. So I think this very traditional kind of view of this unit of scientific communication is not so far off, although having something for smaller scale communication would be a good thing. Now, it's also the case that when it comes to the development of tools, computational tools and so on, there has been sort of an up and down story of whether people consider that to be sort of appropriate academic activity. I don't know the current state of that, but for a long time, if you wrote some computational tool, you couldn't sort of put it on your resume and have it be something that counted towards your academic tenure. It had to be sort of papers and peer-reviewed journals type thing. I don't know if that's changed. It certainly should, and it would be because that's a very valid contribution to kind of the tower of knowledge that gets built. And if it isn't recognized as such, it's a mistake in the recognition, not in the mistake, not a mistake in the doing of that activity. Let's see. Gary asks, how do we decide what science is worth pursuing when almost anything becomes possible? Well, I mean, that could be said about many things. You know, you could write any piece of music by putting the notes together. Which piece do you want to write? That's a matter of human choice. Science, what drives science? Science is sometimes driven by technology, sometimes driven by things like medicine, sometimes, and I have to say this is unfortunately not the most common, it's driven by purely kind of aspirational kind of questions. I mean, it's driven by sort of a desire to understand the world, something sort of very pure and almost aesthetic about kind of, you know, we are what kind of a thing can we build? I mean, just as it's satisfying for us humans to have built cathedrals or something, so I think it's satisfying for us humans to have built kind of the giant edifice that is modern mathematics, for example. But that's something, you know, realistically, that is probably a minority kind of feeling that those things are sort of are things worth aspiring to, so to speak. But I think there's a certain sense of that, a certain aesthetic sense, a certain sense of sort of intellectual closure that can be reached through those kinds of things. And that's something that for some set of people is really a driving force. And I think, you know, one can ask the question, who wants to understand fundamentally how things work? I know I do. I don't know how many other people want to. I think that if you say to people, would you like to figure out the fundamental theory of the universe? Some people would say, hey, that's really cool. We really want to do that. Other people would kind of shrug and say, yeah, I don't know, you know, doesn't really, you know, let me eat better or whatever else. And people will say, what's the point? What do we get from doing that? And the answer is, we get something that kind of, in a kind of almost theological way, kind of takes us sort of closer to kind of the ultimate nature of reality and so on, and the ultimate nature of sort of our place in the universe. But in terms of, you know, does it put better food on my plate? The answer is no. And so that's it's kind of you know, to what extent do you pursue that? I mean, that's been a question for many fields. I mean, you could ask that question for art. Why do we pursue art? You know, do we pursue art? I think we pursue art because it is, well, some people would say we pursue art because it is an ennobling of us to kind of experience good art. Other people, in a more modernistic point of view, will say, you know, it makes us think in unexpected ways or whatever else. Or sometimes it's not really clear what the point is supposed to be. I think that the same can be said of science, pure science, basic science. It's kind of an activity that's a little bit like those kinds of aspirational activities in art and so on. And to have made progress in basic science and to have understood more about how the universe works and so on feels like an ennobling activity. Let's see. David asks, from your perspective, is this a good way to learn programming so the knowledge is stored in long-term memory and remains usable years later instead of being forgotten after sort of short-term practice? How did you personally figure out how you learn best when mastering complex subjects? I think I've talked about that second thing quite a few times, but I'll say a few things here. you know, I always learn best by trying to actually figure things out, by asking questions, often quite foundational questions about different fields, and saying, what do I need to figure out to be able to make progress in this question? And for me, I think using our computational language. When I'm thinking, I'm typing notebooks with computational language and some English text. And that's my kind of medium for thinking. And it has the great feature that I can go back to notebooks that I created in, 1989. I can, fire them up again and they'll still run. And that's a very useful thing. I mean, it used to be the case, and people don't do this really anymore. But when people go through school, they would take notes, and the notes that they took would become the things that they would refer to for the rest of their lives. I mean, that was true, for example, particularly things like ciphering books used in American education in a century ago or something, where people would write out kind of math problems. And then when they were, being farmers trying to figure out, this percentage of that plus whatever, they would go back and look at their ciphering book that they wrote when they were 11 years old or whatever to see what to do. Now, of course, textbooks came in, the web came in, and it is less necessary for sort of traditional knowledge to have to go back to your own notes. Of course, if you are figuring out things for yourself, then your own notes are what you have. I mean, for me, one of the things that I tend to do is that because I kind of make a lot of stuff, publish a lot of stuff, it's convenient for me that things that I knew at some time I probably put out there in the world, and I can find them because they're out there in published resources. That's particularly true of my big book, A New Kind of Science, which came out in 2002, big, thick 1,200-page book that contained in a very dense way just an awful lot of stuff that I had figured out over the 20-something years before that time. And so for me today, probably on most days, I'll go look something up in New Kind of Science, usually abbreviated NKS. Um, and that's very convenient for me. It happens to be something that's sort of widely available in the world, but it could as well be something that I'd stored carefully in my file system and was just looking at for myself. Certainly the source material, which we're finally putting on the web after all these years, finally sort of cleaning it up to the point where it's generally usable for all of NKS and so on. Let's see. I have to say, one of the things that's sort of a new game in town that I haven't really tried is learning interacting with an LLM. I mean, I think it's, for example, if I was, in school trying to memorize things today, I would get an LLM to ask me questions about the things I'm trying to memorize. And, I would prompt the LLM with the thing I'm supposed to remember and say, ask me questions about this. I suspect that would work well. I'm not, haven't been in that business for more than 50 years now. I left high school, yeah, 50 years ago now. So, and haven't been in the doing tests and memorizing things world ever since then, for better or worse. The I think but I think that's kind of a new game in town. I mean, in fact, we've been working quite a lot on sort of AI tools for education, and it'd be an interesting question whether if I wanted to learn a subject, we've built a course, an AI-based course for algebra. I'm not in the business of learning algebra right now. If we built such a course for things I'm trying to learn, like various areas of economics and philosophy and so on, then I might try that as a way to actually learn things. I haven't had the experience of doing it yet. I don't know how well that will work. I know that for myself, it's once I reach a certain level of knowledge in a particular field, it's super useful for me to talk to people who know that field really well. And sometimes that's a double-edged sword because you find people who are real experts in a field and they'll have their own particular shtick about that field. And sometimes it's hard to get the big picture of the field. And for me, I have to already have some of the big picture before I go talk to this particular expert. And then because I have some view of the big picture, I can know what the things, how the things that they're telling me fit in to other things out there in the field. What I tend to find is that some fraction of the way through learning a field, I'll go from every time I talk to somebody, they tell me things I didn't know, to when I talk to people, the things they tell me are things that fit into things I already knew. And it's always a good feeling. I've done that many, many times with many different fields. And it kind of, you feel like you're drowning when, you keep on learning new things and this new thing is coming at you and it's kind of like I'm not going to make it for this field. But then at some point it all comes to closure and the things you hear start repeating and repeating and repeating. And then it's like, yep, I've got my arms around this particular field. And that's the time when I feel like I got some confidence in making progress in that field and so on. Let's see. Uh, let's see. Sobin is asking, the context of LLMs, how important is it to provide access to curated databases or labels of answers on particular topics? Is this something that our company aims for? Well, we have put out a great deal of kind of information about the world and algorithms and so on and so on and so on. And I think we've been LLMs have eaten that all up, and we've helped them do that in many cases. Um, I think that the level of structuring that one needs to do is something that's a question. I mean, at time, in practical terms, it's like you've got a document. Do you convert it into Markdown? Yeah, we're doing that kind of thing. Is that really going to be necessary? Probably not. Probably if you just feed the LLMs kind of any old sort of documents in any format, they're going to be able to untangle that. That's a matter of sort of the harnesses around LLMs. It's something which I think is sort of readily coming, and it's not really the effort to let me prepare it for the LLM is not going to be so important. Let me have it be there in the first place. That's important. Actually having the material exposed in some way, creating the material to begin with, that's important. I mean, I know, for example, these live streams that I do generate a lot of transcripts that contain, answers to things which LLMs can then go and use. But if I hadn't exposed those answers, and often when you guys ask me all kinds of questions where I've never thought about that question before, and I have to try and come up with the answer here, those answers are sort of created for the first time here, and then they can be scooped up by LLMs to use for what they do. Justine asks, how do we prevent students from outsourcing all thinking to AI without banning it outright? Should schools explicitly teach students how to work with LLMs, not just restrict them? Look, there's a really simple principle. If you're going to have a tool that you're going to be able to use for the rest of your life, you might as well learn how to use it. And if everybody can stop working and just turn it all over to AIs, then, well, I don't think that's going to happen for many reasons. But the kinds of work that get done change a bit. The kinds of things, it's no longer useful to learn that sort of, well, to learn that kind of particular low-level thing because, yeah, that can be done automatically. It's no longer useful. In my life, the transition happened between when, any real programmer would learn assembly language to then any real programmer will learn C to, we've got now sort of high-level computational language, Wolfram language, for example, where you can just learn that. Lots of kinds of things you want to do, you just have to learn that. You don't have to go to the lower levels and learn all those kinds of things. And you might have said, let's outlaw, we really need people to learn assembly language. Let's outlaw any higher level language because it makes it too easy. I think that that's kind of a mistake. It's kind of a bad way to think about it. Now, the question is, what is it that people really need to do? They need to be doing things that aren't just, oh, you were asked a question, there's a standard answer, can you trot out the answer? It's more, how do you think about something? What questions are worth asking? All these kinds of things. These are things which the more that one can teach people to think as part of education, I think the more valuable that will be. And the kinds of thinking that one does, there's a lot of thinking that is just for what we choose to do as humans, which, other than the AIs reflecting what we've already chosen, it's something that we get to do for ourselves. And that's sort of what one should focus on in education. I mean, there's a lot, learning the mechanics of things that have been automated by mathematical and Wolfram language for 38 years is not necessarily useful. It's learning, how to do some algebraic computation is is not necessarily the point. I mean, that might be an interest in its own right, but the more important thing is now that you can do that, what can you build? What's the tower you can build that goes taller? And yes, there's a taller tower you can build with AI and so on. And now we have to figure out what do we teach that makes use of that taller tower, and and how do we teach kind of AI criticism, so to speak? How do you tell? How do you read AI with the appropriate level of skepticism? How do you leverage what's possible there? That's my view of that. And if you've got an exercise, I mean, this happened particularly when Wolfram Alpha came out, there were exercises that people were doing in areas like math and chemistry and things like this, where it's just, look, I'm sorry, you can just do it. Wolfram Alpha just does it. Now, did that mean nobody did those exercises anymore? No, it didn't. There were people who were interested in doing those exercises. There were people who were never going to be interested in doing those exercises and would find some way to get the answer without doing the exercise. And Wolfram Alpha was a much richer way to do that, with a lot more kind of actual, you learn something because you're seeing things other than just, oh yeah, the guy last year was doing the same homework and left it for me, and now I can just write down the answer. You get to see the whole thing in a much more contextualized way in Wolfram Alpha, and so on. Max is commenting, with LLM prompting, you have to be critical of every answer and play your own devil's advocate. Yes, indeed, and it's quite educational. It makes a very glib statement. This is true. You look at it, you think about it, you realize, no, it's actually total nonsense. I mean, in a sense, it's a little disappointing in terms of sort of the social dynamic of it, because people confidently saying things that are complete nonsense is something that doesn't happen that much in the world. It's like people, one likes to think, and I think it's true, that people don't just sort of lie about things most of the time. Most of the time you have, kind of more or less the straight story. And with LLMs, it's kind of become more taken for granted that people will just talk nonsense. Or LLMs at least will just talk nonsense. It kind of socializes the idea of talking nonsense, which is not a good thing. It certainly doesn't make the world an easier place to operate effectively in. Let's see. It's comments. I've seen so many examples of companies trying to use LLMs as search engines and never seen it turn out well. Is it possible for LLMs to reliably retrieve factual information, or is it a fool's errand? Well, I think that it's absolutely useful to use an LLM to kind of do thematic searching. Where are you looking? What is there at the end is something where you want to pull out the thing that was actually there at the end, the piece of database, the computation, whatever else. LLMs are a great kind of linguistic interface to things. They're a great way to have kind of this fuzzy linguistic interface. I mean, it's kind of like graphical user interfaces. You might have said, I want precise control over what's going into my computer and so on. I don't want to just move a window around on the screen and it's kind of, I'm moving this pixel from here to here and it's not precisely right. How can I live with that? But in fact, graphical user interfaces are very useful, even though in some sense aspects of them are not as precise as if you were typing every character to say exactly what you want to have happen. And I think the same is true with the linguistic interface that's provided by LLMs. And it's really just a question of sort of getting used to using that in an effective way. I think that ultimately it's a way of accessing tools, and the tools can be precise. I mean, we built kind of the sort of biggest example of a computation and knowledge tool in Wolfram language that LLMs can access, and LLMs can sort of be a human tells the LLM roughly what they want. The LLM kind of goes agentic and figures out, kind of it needs to get this and needs to get that and needs to get the other thing. that's actually a fairly shallow thing to try to do. And then when it really gets into depth of, oh, I want to compute this thing, I want to search all these rows of this database or whatever else, that's done by sort of hard tools that are not part of the kind of interface provided by the LLM. Uh, let's see. It's also asking, do you think there's an opportunity for development of an educational LLM, i.e. a dedicated system specifically designed to aid discovery and understanding as opposed to simply providing an answer? Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, is there a uh, is there a kind of Socratic LLM that you can build that never answers your question? It just asks you other questions. It would be an interesting experiment. It might work quite well. I mean, I think that it's a little bit, people go a little bit wild on that kind of idea. Like people say, there's certain kinds of things in sort of philosophy and the way you think about yourself and the world and so on that you probably can discover, you can educate in the Latin sense of to draw out, so to speak, that you can imagine it's all in there, but we have to draw it out in some way. And that you can do sort of Socratically by just asking questions, and an LLM could probably be quite good at that. But there are other things where it's just like there's no amount of drawing out that's going to tell you what the distance to the nearest star is. Unless you heard it somewhere or know it somehow, that's not a piece of knowledge that an individual person can intrinsically know. I mean, it's sort of an interesting thing to realize. Back in antiquity, back in ancient Greek times, when when Socrates was plying his trade, most things were things that an unaided human could know and or could figure out. Whereas today, there's enough depth of knowledge in both the kind of the amount of knowledge and the level, the extent to which knowledge has been accumulated, not by direct human experience that anybody could have, but by sending spacecraft out there or by running computers for a long time or whatever else. And so it becomes something where the notion of education, where you're pulling out from what's already there, isn't quite as realistic. And you have to kind of explain things that are part of the corpus of human knowledge and so on before you can pull things out. You have to push things in before you can pull things out. But I think that's an interesting question. If you can give some pieces of information and then you sort of try and pull out the links between them, I don't know. I think it's a reasonable thing to try. Let's see. There's a question here from Technical. What's a significant scientific discovery you'd like to see being made during this year? Oh my. It's always so difficult to know timescales for things. I mean, I think that, I can say for myself personally, there are a bunch of things that are happening around our physics project and so on, where I'd really like to know what some experimental implications of our model of physics is. I'd really like to know, is dark matter in fact space-time heat? And how could we know that? These kinds of things. Those are discoveries that might just get made one day. We're primed, we're ready. There's just work to be done, and it might just happen. Hard to know. I think in the world at large, there are plenty of areas where there's sort of breakthrough discoveries that could be made. I mean, in biomedicine, there are sort of breakthrough discoveries like how do you reprogram cells to go back to being stem cells? How do you clone mammals? One that's certainly a coming attraction there is cryonics. How do you freeze humans and bring them back from being frozen type thing? My guess is that will be a point discovery. When will it happen? Who knows? But that's a thing where, you find the right cryoprotectant, you find the right, high pressure magnetic field, something or other thing, and it's just going to work. Or maybe it's physically impossible, but I don't think it is. And it's certainly encouraged that, there are fish that get frozen all winter and so on. But that's an example of something where there could be a sort of point discovery in that area. I think in biomedicine, there are also more kind of, that's a cool hack that will allow you to cure a bunch of diseases and so on. I can imagine those things being discovered. I think that there are things in, I mean, this is sort of the spectrum of different kinds of things that might happen. I think one of the sort of coming attractions is going to be sort of humanoid robotics that really works. There'll be a ChatGPT-like moment for that, probably. I don't know when it will happen, but that's sort of another coming attraction. There'll be things to do with nanotechnology, where it's kind of, can you build things at a molecular scale, or can you even build a universal constructor that operates at a molecular scale? These are things that I think are sort of things that might be kind of point discoveries and so on. I think, well, those are a few kinds of things, but would they happen this next year? No idea. It's really hard to tell those kinds of things. Like if you'd asked, when will ChatGPT happen? Nobody knew it could happen. Nobody knew it would be a point thing that it happened. And certainly nobody knew it was going to happen in late 2022. That's just not something you can sort of pinpoint in thinking through how things develop in science. It's a question here from Ricard. What do you think about the concept of technological singularity? Oh my. I mean, I think sort of what is the concept? The concept is things happen faster and faster and faster. Things are growing, going exponentially faster. And eventually it'll get to the point where things sort of get infinitely fast and infinite things are discovered infinitely quickly. Not going to happen that way. I know that from a very foundational theoretical point of view, this idea of computational irreducibility that I talk about a lot, even when you know the rules for a system, you can't kind of jump ahead and immediately work out what it will do. You have to just sort of follow each step and see what happens. One of the consequences of computational irreducibility is there's an infinite chain of discoveries that can be made. You'll never be able to make the master discovery that discovers all discoveries. You're still stuck doing things in our physical world, which itself is kind of executing this irreducible computation which corresponds to the passage of time. So I think the idea that, the moment will come when it's all figured out and we can just jump and say the answer is 42 and we're done. That's just, for theoretical reasons, that's just never going to happen. That's not going to be the way it works. There is an infinite frontier of invention and discovery to be made. The question of whether we, for example, care about those discoveries, that's a different question. There are discoveries to be made about all the possible theorems of mathematics. Most of them we don't care about. There are discoveries to be made about all kinds of weird materials that you could create. Some of them will be useful, some of them won't be. But I think that the idea that sort of things speed up to the point where it's infinite speed, so, that's partly a consequence of saying, the AI will figure out how to figure itself out and it will spin itself up to infinite speed. It's just not going to happen. That's what computational irreducibility, undecidability, the halting problem, Gödel's theorem, they're all kind of saying the same thing, which amounts to that's not going to happen. You can never have something which sort of infinitely jumps ahead infinitely quickly. It is not the nature of not the sort of, it's not a question of what's physically buildable. It's a question of what abstractly is possible, what abstractly makes sense. So, it's so I think kind of the self-improving AI that's suddenly going to jump to infinitely improving itself. I just don't believe in that scenario. I think I find it kind of amusing that there are people I know who are, on the one hand, say the world's getting exponentially faster, and other people who say, I can't believe everything is happening so slowly and that we have such sort of lame advances in technology. How can both of these things be true? I think part of the point is that in well-developed fields, there's just more and more of the same, and there's more and more and more of the same. It's sort of exponentially larger numbers of papers, exponentially larger numbers of patents. I don't know if there are exponentially larger numbers of companies. I wouldn't be totally surprised. But within a well-developed field, you can just pile on more incremental stuff, and it looks like more and more and more is happening. But the real progress gets made between existing fields, and those are things that are quite invisible if you're looking at measuring things by the particulars of some particular field. And so if you're measuring things by the particulars of that field, you're like, well, nothing's really happening. It's just incremental more of the same. But if you're looking just within that field, you say it's more and more and more of that incremental stuff. It's exponentially increasing amounts of exponential stuff. But then as you look, sort of the real progress is getting made, not in what you're looking at, because it's between these fields. And so that's why both of those points of view about things are speeding up exponentially and things are incredibly slow, they're both sort of right and they're both sort of wrong for this reason. Um, let's see. JH is asking if an LLM were trained not to guess the next words, but to guess the previous words, uh, could you give it an end state and go back from that? Is that harder? No, actually, there are many situations in which you want to do kind of, you want to say things like, I've got this context, fill in what's in the middle, I've got what's here, what's likely to have come before it, and so on. One of the things that I've done experiments on, so have other people, is kind of the planning LLM. You say, I've got this, an LLM is just putting down essentially one token at a time and then looking at what had come before. I mean, in earlier times, there used to be this amusing thing that you could do with an LLM that would say it would produce some result, and then you would say, that's wrong, look at what you just did. And it would say, oh, I'm terribly sorry. I can see that what I just did was wrong. The reason it didn't know what it was doing was wrong was it was always going out in front. It was always just putting down another word. And it was only after you say, take a look at what you wrote, look back, that it had that whole thing in its context. And it could then say, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. The next thing I'm going to say is, that doesn't make sense. So there's sort of a question of could you, in an actual LLM right now, it's following a single path of I'm going to say this, I'm going to say this, I'm going to say this. It's building a single future for itself. You could imagine building a whole sort of quantum kind of set of parallel paths of the future and somehow pruning those parallel paths to say, I'm going to look at which of those paths lands in a place where I want it to land. There's various kinds of work that's been done on that. That's closer to diffusion models and so on. It's not clear how that will work out. Um, let's see. There's a question here. Will we ever, from Davy, will we ever have cybernetically enhanced memory? Would this be a great leveler for people with otherwise similar intelligence? I mean, we already have cybernetically enhanced memory. Somebody like me has stored, every message I've sent and received for, what is it now, 35, more than 35 years. And, I can immediately recall things. Oh yeah, I had that conversation with this person 20 years ago. And, I wrote notes about it at the time, and now I can remember that. And it's very cybernetically enhanced and it's very, very useful. And, I have a fairly decent memory as a pure human, but me with my computer as my sort of enhanced memory, I think we're pretty good at remembering things. So I think it's already there. I mean, whether if it's like, oh, I'm just going to think and it's all happening inside my mind and with neural links or whatever else, that's a different thing. But we're so close to that now. I don't think that's going to be much different. I mean, the fact that we can store all this information, I mean, I really notice it's very interesting to me. It's kind of like things before the web, things after the web, things where you could know a bunch of stuff about the world and things where you would have a very hard time knowing that stuff about the world. Before phone cameras and after phone cameras. There was a time, I was like, there are things where I wonder, is there a picture of that thing from the 1970s? And the answer is probably not. Nobody was running around taking pictures of things. And, even though many people saw the thing, nobody took a picture of it. Nobody came in with a camera and took that picture. Whereas today, because we always have, we all have sort of cameras in our pocket or even on our wrist or whatever it is, There's much more of a tendency to just take a picture when you feel like taking a picture. I think I'm not modernized enough actually in that regard. I take fewer pictures than I probably should. But that's another sort of form of enhanced memory. And as it becomes easier to sort of decode what's in pictures, it becomes easier to sort of have that even more memory. I mean, I think it will be the case. It's an interesting question whether if we had those little, cameras on our glasses or something, and we were just recording everything, how much would that help us? I mean, in a sense, there's always the question of when do you see the forest for the trees? You can have all this detailed information, but if you can't kind of summarize it in sort of a narrative of history, it doesn't do you very much good. One thing I know, I haven't been doing this, unfortunately, two iterations of this company went out of business, but there used to be a company that would make little cameras that you could sort of clip on that would take a picture every, I don't know what it was, 15 seconds or something. And I used to take those to things like trade shows. And then I would be able to, after the trade show, I would be able to see what booth did I visit or what person was I talking to, because the camera's resolution was enough that it could read the badge of the person I'd been talking to. And it's like, yeah, I talked to that person for 12 minutes or whatever. But I have to say that it was sort of interesting because it was very granular and it was very kind of hard to know what was important out of it. I mean, I suppose it's like looking at security camera footage. Most of it is quite uninteresting. I mean, sometimes you can get, there was motion then and it wasn't just a bird or something. But I think this question of how do you extract from sort of a bigger stream of data, how do you extract things that are useful is an interesting one. I mean, I personally collect all kinds of personal analytics, whether it's, every heartbeat, every step, every keystroke I type, all those kinds of things. What do you make out of that? I can tell you that I've occasionally made very aggregated conclusions from those things, but it's not like the immediate recall of what was the sequence of keystrokes I typed at this particular time. That's really important. It is interesting when I've discovered things in science, for example. It's pretty cool to be able to say, this was the second when I made that discovery. This was the set of keystrokes I typed. This was the thing I saw on the screen. It happened at, 11:23 and 42 seconds. That was what I saw and that was what I figured out at that time. It's interesting to go and do that. I don't know, is it fundamentally significant to be able to do that? I'm not sure, but it certainly gives you this sort of new level of computational history. But the problem is, how do you see the forest for the trees? How is it the case that out of all these little tiny point things of every keystroke and so on, how do you extract from that the overall narrative of history? It is an interesting sort of general conceptual point that there is typically an overall narrative of history. It could be the case that, in the world with 8 billion people and so on, everybody's doing their own thing, there'd be no coherent narrative about what's happened in the world. People would always argue about which narrative it should be, but fundamentally, we at least we imagine that there's a coherent narrative about what happens in the world. And there's sort of a significant history that one can tell about what happened from which one can make new conclusions. And the same is true with us as humans. It will be interesting when there are tools, and this is something I've been interested in being able to do, and LLMs help a bit to be able to go from all those, for me, whatever it is, 4 million emails, and be able to tell the story. What happened? Each email by itself, I jump into some random time in 1992 and look at what emails there were. It's like one drowns in all the detail. But what was the overall arc of that narrative? What was happening at that time? That's something one could now expect with sort of a computational history to be able to do. And I think it's to the question that was asked about whether sort of cybernetically enhanced memory levels things out. Look, I think that the presence of knowledge on the web, the presence of kind of all of the tools I built, other people have built, the presence of more and more kind of personal data that one can record. Yes, there are lots of things that in the past one would have been blocked from a particular area. For example, for myself, I was never a big enthusiast of doing math by hand. wasn't, I don't know, I don't think I was particularly good at it. I don't really know whether I was good at it, but I didn't think I was particularly good at it. And that could have meant I'm blocked from doing theoretical physics because I don't want to be doing all these complicated algebra calculations by hand. But for myself, I realized, wait a minute, I can just make a tool that does that. And I've absolutely not been blocked. In fact, my tool has given me a big platform to be able to do much more in that area. And so I think this question, it is certainly true that there are things where the automation of those things will go from somebody that is blocked from working in that area because of something that they're not so good at to something where they don't have to be blocked at all. I mean, if you fundamentally can't spell checkers will save you. You know, if you an interesting one for me right now is I don't do physical experiments. I have done, only a handful of chemistry experiments in my life. They mostly didn't work, etc. So an interesting question. I worked for many years with a company called Emerald Cloud Lab that's been building a big biology and chemistry lab in the cloud. I mean, it's a physical sort of factory-like thing where you program it in Wolfram language and it goes off and does physical experiments and does all that pipetting and all those kinds of, mass spectrometry or whatever it is that you need to do. So an interesting question is whether, given that level of automation, a person like me can actually do physical experiments and have them work out. I did make some attempts there, and I discovered that there were so many details in how you set the PCR machine or whatever that I don't know. I think that's now improving by using machine learning to look at kind of what the defaults should be based on what people have written in papers and so on. But that's an interesting case where, for me personally, I don't know whether I would be good at doing physical experiments. I haven't done very many of them. I have the self-image that I don't think I'd be particularly good at them. And it's so, will the automation of these things allow me to be at the point where I can do more science because I can now routinely do physical experiments or not? I think it's very likely that it will be. So, these things where we get sort of cybernetic enhancement, they allow people who would otherwise be blocked from a particular area, as I might have been from theoretical physics, had I not had kind of computers as tools, that allows one to kind of level that playing field. I think that's absolutely correct. And I think that, when it comes to sort of memory of things, in the doing of science, yes, it is super useful to be able to remember things from here and there and pull them in when you need to. It's not necessary for doing science. There are many areas of science where you don't need that. Yeah, I think that's but it's certainly useful when you can get it. All right, I should wrap up and go back to my day job here. But thanks for some interesting questions, and I look forward to chatting with you all another time. Bye for now.